Okay, welcome everybody to today's CGHS research webinar. Today, our presenter is going to be John Gardner. Dr. John Gardner has served as the Director of Title IX and Training at ATSU University since October 2018, and he has always had a passion for understanding equity, privilege, oppression, and inclusion. In his previous role as the Director of Residence Life at Truman State University, from 2009 to 2018, Dr. Gardner developed an interest in equity as it is related to Title IX, sexual misconduct, and federal regulations. These interests led to pursuit of a PhD at Colorado State University and in higher education leadership focused on the impact of federal sexual misconduct policy impact on college students with minoritized intersectional identities using critical quantitative methodology. Dr. Gardner had previously received his bachelor's degree from Lewis and Clark College in 2003 in history and his master's degree from Iowa State University in 2008 in higher education administration. So with that, John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, Dr. Presley, and it's nice to be able to present my research. And I thank you all for joining. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here if I can do that. Let's see. There we go. There we go. Everybody able to see that all right? I want to say before I get started, talking about sexual misconduct, which is something that impacts many of us in different ways. I try to discuss this topic in a way that hopefully won't be triggering or offensive to anyone. But I just want to say that ahead of time. I know this is something that is not a us and them concept. It's a we concept, and so I just like to start any presentation with that acknowledgement. My dissertation is titled Federal Sexual Misconduct Policy Impact on Intersectional Identities, a Critical Quantitative Study. It's something I completed. The study was completed in 2018. Graduated last spring, 2019. When I think about the need for this study, sexual misconduct is obviously a serious concern on college campuses. When we look at the research over the last 30 years, it stayed fairly consistent. About 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 women have experienced rape or attempted rape while they're on campus. About 1 in 16 men have experienced the same thing. So when we look at this from it's a very common experience, unfortunately, a common trauma and something that needs to be addressed. There wasn't a large-scale governmental intervention until really 2011 and 2014 with the Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education. And these letters provided guidance expecting campuses to address sexual misconduct as a violation of the law, in terms of it's an expectation that this sort of discrimination should not happen. And then 2013, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act provided specific guidance in the law about education, about reporting processes, things like that for higher education that were needed. These expectations, demanded that campuses educate students on what sexual misconduct is, how to report it, how to intervene, and those kinds of things. There's no known evaluation besides this study of the VAWA reauthorization of 2013 as it applies to higher education, especially on a large scale. And there's little understanding in the research about how sexual misconduct impacts minoritized, vulnerable, and marginalized populations, especially using an intersectional framework. And so that's an important component of what I've done here. The research questions that I used in the study were kind of broken into two different sections. So question 1 and 2 focus on the entire sample of the study. So how much did the rate of sexual misconduct at institutions of higher education change after the passage of the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013? And I looked at a 5-year period from 2012 to 2016 to analyze that. And then question 2 is, what did the rate of services sought for victim survivors of sexual misconduct change at institutions of higher education after the passage of VAWA? So again, those first 2 questions focus on the whole sample of the study, kind of looking at the bigger picture. And then questions 3 and 4 focus on those same topics in terms of the rate of sexual misconduct by victim survivors, but it focuses on intersectional identities. So we're looking at race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender, and those specific social locations where those interact with one another. And then for question 4, again, the rate of services sought for sexual misconduct by victim survivors of different intersectional identities, again, focused on race, ethnicity, sexuality, and kind of trying to look at what is the overall experience for the entire sample, and then what is the specific experience of these intersectional identities. The intersectional framework, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit throughout the presentation today, really focuses on going beyond the concept of studies that were dominated by white cisgender women participants. What a lot of the literature shows is that these studies, in an attempt to get statistical significance, used populations that were driven by this one social location, white cisgender women. And there's a need to go beyond that to understand the impact of policy on different populations as well. So there's little investigation of race, sexuality, gender, things like that. There is some, but it's limited, and it doesn't drive the policy. And then also recognizing that sexual misconduct is not a socially neutral event. How someone experiences sexual misconduct, the services they seek, things like that afterwards are impacted by their social location. So a Black woman will experience sexual misconduct and the services available much differently than a white woman or a Latino male. And so looking at those and understanding those socially neutral events are not a thing, and the social context matters. And then inequity in policy can impact the specific social location of different intersectional identities. And just to provide an example of that, when you look at the Black community, for example, when you have a Black man and a Black woman, you look at the needs around this particular policy, you have very different needs. Black men are disproportionately accused of sexual misconduct, and so policy needs they have are focused on things like due process and appropriate investigative procedures. Whereas when you look at Black women, they disproportionately experience sexual misconduct, and so when you look at their needs, it's more about what are the reporting and support processes for someone who has experienced this. How can we educate and decrease the likelihood of the sexual misconduct occurring? So getting into some of the literature that drove where the research went, again, looking at intersectionality, I've talked about some of this already. There's little literature focused on populations outside of cisgender white females. And so this concept of this intersectional research challenges within sexual misconduct policy, within sexual misconduct literature, the whiteness of women and the heterosexuality of everyone. And so the strong narrative within this literature, within the policy, is the concept that the victim survivor is a white woman, and that the sexual misconduct that was committed was a heterosexual act by a man. And not that that isn't disproportionately what the statistics show, but that's not the only story that occurs. And so part of the effort of this study was to find those other stories and determine what those other needs might be. I talked briefly just a moment ago about the conflicting policy needs of different intersectional identities. And lastly, the intersectionality and quantitative data, and this is a quantitative study, and we'll get a little bit more into that in just a moment, but intersectionality is commonly associated with qualitative data because of the ability to dive deep into someone's individual experience around their individual location. However, there is a need to tie intersectionality into quantitative data because of the desire to be able to understand a greater framework of the inequity in things such as policy. And Cho, Crenshaw, and McCall quoted, rather what makes an analysis intersectional, whatever terms it deploys, whatever its iteration, whatever its field or discipline, is its adoption of an intersectional way of thinking about the problem of sameness and the difference and its relation to power. And so that concept of thinking about how we're thinking about the study, less so than a particular type of data set needed, focuses on what makes something intersectional. And thinking about this through a critical realism ontology focuses on the fact that we may not be able to totally understand the absolute experience, but we may be able to get appropriately closer to understanding what realism, what reality is for the participants in the study. Looking at the culture of sexual misconduct, there were some things that really came out that I think are important to understand. Sexual misconduct has been thought of as a few bad men doing bad things repeatedly. And what a lot of the studies indicate is that we have some concerns related to overall culture. Gender role conflict, specifically with men acting in direct conflict with their stated values and committing violence, homophobia, alcohol abuse, sexual aggression, has created a very narrow definition of masculinity that really inhibits the ability to intervene as bystanders in dangerous situations for others, because the culture is so messed up, for lack of a better term, and it connects back to these men's understanding of heterosexuality. They come to campus with some predetermined expectations related to sexuality. Sexual aggression sort of results from this, where we have men ostracizing others who do not engage in alcohol abuse, competing for women, feeling as though they deserve sex, and then when they don't get what they feel they deserve, that results in higher likelihood of sexual assault, rape, things like that. And we have men coming to campus, about 15% having already committed sexual misconduct, and about 35% would commit sexual misconduct if they thought they could get away with it. And so we're moving away from that concept in the literature of a few bad men creating acts, and we have a higher percentage, probably more like 15%, who are committing sexual misconduct most likely one time, but because of the cultural issues related to aggression and masculinity and things like that, it's occurring commonly in that setting. And then with alcohol, the research over and over talks about the likelihood that either the perpetrator or the victim survivor have used alcohol in the evening of the assault. And when we look at sexual misconduct in terms of the experience of it, again, the literature's focused on cisgender white women. Many studies have focused on some prevention efforts, but those prevention efforts tend to be short-term with small groups and over a short period of time. And what those studies have found is that most prevention efforts don't actually reduce the likelihood of sexual misconduct occurring. What they do is they educate about rape myths and things like that, but they don't actually reduce the likelihood of the assault occurring. And the focus on cisgender white women has excluded our trans persons who experience sexual misconduct at 2 to 3 times the normal rate of cisgender persons. We have studies that show that racialized minorities experience at much higher rates than white persons. We have studies that show that those with disabilities experience at a higher rate than others. And so what we're seeing is not only are there these studies showing concerns relating our marginalized populations, but the prevention efforts are not changing the rate of sexual misconduct occurring for anyone. And there's very limited studies in terms of large scale or longer time periods. The longest study I could find was about a 7-month study. And so really trying to reach out and see what we see over longer periods of time was needed. And then when we were thinking about looking at the literature about services after experiencing sexual misconduct, there's strong potential for trauma there. Usually reporting sexual misconduct is not a good experience for the person that experienced it. It's usually not trauma informed, and even if it is trauma informed, going through a legal process, a participant can experience something called critogenic harm, where they have a delay in therapeutic development. They're required to remain compensatorily harmed. They have an invasion of privacy and boundary breaking. There's adversarialization. And so a lot of times reporting sexual misconduct results in trauma that can be as bad or even worse than the actual misconduct itself. So few often seek professional assistance because they're not aware of it, because they haven't reported it properly. And so then those services are not made available to them. And then few report to the police or institutional members because of the fear of the response and what it's going to be. Most reporting is to a friend or a family member. And that's why education through VAWA, required by VAWA for friends, employees, things like that, institutions has been so important. So moving on to the methodology of the study, again, use quantitative data, and I'll get to where the collection of the data in a moment. But it was a 5-year study looking at 2012, 2013 as sort of the pre-years in the study, and then there was the intervention of the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act in 2013, and then looking at how that changed the data in years 2014, 2015, and 2016 at those different social locations that we developed. And I used a critical analysis to look at the data, and what a critical analysis meant in this instance was trying to find those structures of inequity in regard to how that policy was experienced. And so critical analysis advises not to use statistical significance for a number of different reasons, but one of which is significance often indicates sameness in the experience. And I think that intersectionality would argue that there isn't sameness of experience, and that's something that I've found to be true in the research findings, and we'll get to those in a minute. Additionally, I did a couple pilot studies on answering some different questions using the same data set, and what we found was a higher likelihood of type 1 errors because of the large size of the sample, where we had statistical significance, but the likelihood that it was real significance in terms of practical significance was highly unlikely. Additionally, when we have type 2, you're likely to have type 2 errors when you have very small populations like we do in some of these social locations amongst a very large sample size. And so we had some concerns there as well. And so critical analysis made more sense. And I'll get into how we conducted that critical analysis here in a moment. The models that were used were policy analysis, and you can look at policy a number of different ways. You can analyze the language in the policy, you can analyze the implementation of the policy. What I looked at here was the policy process by focusing on the impact and the policy is experienced by the participant. So when we think about the impact, we're talking about the participant, and so the student in this case. Additionally, is a trends analysis. The study took place over 5 years, but it wasn't a longitudinal study because the samples changed every year. It wasn't the same group over the 5-year time period. Same type of group in terms of college students in the state of Missouri, but it wasn't the same group. And then looking at intersectionality again, stepping out of that qualitative framework, but making sure that understood from the literature what the potentials were for these different social locations so that could have complexity in the analytical process. So in the data collection, I looked at a variety of variables, and the data was collected using the Missouri College Health Behavior Survey, which is a survey that's structured on the Young Adult Alcohol Problem Screening Test, which has good reliability and validity. It's been tested out many times. And then it was the Missouri College Health Behavior Survey is conducted by the state or by the University of Missouri, and I was able to access the data set. It is used on 21 institutions in the state of Missouri, public, private, big, small, a whole lot of different institutions. And it was collected online. The survey was administered to initially, depending on the size of the institution, either a quarter of the institution if it was a larger institution, or the entire institution if it was a smaller institution. So the return rate was 21% on that 25% that were initially surveyed, which comes back to 6% of the total population of college students in the state of Missouri, which is a good return rate for an online tool, investigative tool. So we had about 49,000 participants over the 5 years of the study. Again, focused on race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender. And the experience of sexual misconduct, so whether or not a participant experienced sexual misconduct, and the experience of the services they sought after experiencing sexual misconduct. And then the year of the study was obviously another variable. The data analysis was looking at cross-tabular analysis, looking at to find those different social locations to determine if there was a curvilinear trend using the researcher as the analyst tool. So I was looking at the data. Again, the data wouldn't have, the approach doesn't work from a statistical significance, and the numbers didn't work for many of our social locations to be using statistical significance either. So looking at those intersections of race, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality, and looking at those changes in experience of sexual misconduct over time. Again, the statistical significance implies sameness of experience, and we're really trying to stay away from that. And so we're connecting back to the literature and what it told us about the experience of these different identities, and then trying to apply that in a setting where we had intersectional identities and social locations. So now we're looking at behavioral change, which can be kind of a squishy topic to look at from a research perspective, but relying on inference around behavioral change can be hard as well. So, all right, moving on to the findings. So research question 1, which again, this is the research where we're looking at, did the rate of sexual misconduct increase, decrease, stay the same over the time frame of the study for the entire sample? And what we found in the sample was that overall the rate of sexual misconduct increased over the time of the study. It didn't what we would have liked to see is an increase with it bringing the violence reauthorization in, and then a decrease at the end, but we just saw an overall increase. And there was a reduction in being taken advantage of sexually after drinking, which is a good sign, but there was an increase in the rate of overall non-consensual sexual contact and an increase in the rate of sexual assault. Research question 2, here we're looking at what was the experience for the entire sample regarding experiencing or seeking assistance, and then how effective was that assistance. There was an increase in participants seeking assistance, which is a good sign, but it was inconclusive evidence as to the effectiveness of how that assistance was received. Again, to research question 3, here we start looking at those social locations and how they experienced the rate of sexual misconduct. around ethnicity and gender, there was no clear response to the policy like we would have expected to see. There was some potential trend, some uneven data around Latina and female participants and Latino and male participants. Ethnicity and sexuality, again, there was potential trend for Hispanic, Latinx, and heterosexual participants, but no clear trend for any of those social locations. With race and gender, there was clear evidence of a curvilinear trend for female and Asian or Asian American participants, and another clear evidence of a trend for female and white or European American or Caucasian participants. There were some potential trends there as well, but the clear evidence was the two there at the top. For race and sexuality, there was clear evidence of a trend related to Asian and Asian American and heterosexual participants. And there's potential trend for a bunch of participants, social locations, but those trends obviously were not as clear as we would have liked. Looking at research question 4, here we're looking at whether participants sought assistance after experiencing sexual misconduct and how effective that assistance was. With Hispanic and Latino and female, we saw, again, potential, and Hispanic, Latino, male, we saw potential as well. And then ethnicity and sexuality, we saw potential for a trend with Hispanic, Latino, and gay, and Hispanic, Latinx, and heterosexual, and Hispanic, Latinx, and queer, but again, no clear trend for ethnicity on either gender or sexuality. We look at race and gender, we saw a clear curvilinear trend around Black, African American, or Native American and female, and white, European American, or Caucasian and female. So you see a commonality there of female. Some potential trends for some other populations, but clear trend there with those two at the top. Race and sexuality, again, similar to ethnicity, did not indicate a clear trend, but indicated some potential for trend in a number of different areas. So we get into discussion, kind of what did our findings mean? When looking at research question 1, the overall increase in sexual misconduct may be related to more instances of sexual misconduct occurring, or may be caused by more awareness by students of what sexual misconduct is. Again, over the time period of the study, we should have seen educational efforts according to the VAWA reauthorization expectations. However, and the literature would support that with clarification and education regarding what sexual misconduct is, there should be increased reporting. So it's most likely that is what occurred, that it wasn't necessarily an increase in sexual misconduct, but an increase in students' awareness of what that was. So that is likely what we saw there. With research question 2, participants sought assistance at a higher rate. And so again, VAWA requested that reporting and assistance options be made more available, be made easier to make. And so we would have expected, again, with that educational efforts identified in research question 1, that same educational efforts would have impacted the reporting and seeking of assistance. The effectiveness of assistance received was less clear in the results. Literature was somewhat unclear as to what might drive this, but there could be evidence of a lack of effectiveness of new processes, and some of this is just anecdotal of my experience around that time, that at the time that VAWA was passed and new processes were being put in place and new employees were being put in new positions, there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change, new folks taking on new roles that they perhaps weren't prepared for, and so that could be impactful in terms of how that assistance was received. Looking at research question 3, here we get into our social locations, and I think some of the most interesting part of the study. What we see is that the response is indicated by whether or not there is, in many instances, a dominant identity as a part of the social location. So when we looked at our heterosexual participants, female participants, white participants, and then Asian American participants as well, they showed up as responding to the policy, and you see that heterosexual female white participant there is kind of a conglomeration of who is responsive to the policy. So it's sort of expected that the policy created by literature driven around white female heterosexual participants would have showed up as more responsive to the policy. So that's expected. A notable exception is that there was no difference across racial social locations amongst sexuality and race, and that's an interesting aspect of it. Now, something to note. Research question 4, again, similar to research question 3, results showed the benefit of a privileged aspect of a social location. Again, we see cisgender, female, white participants showing up with being responsive to the policy. So this is sort of consistent with the ability to build trust a process, to report and experience that process positively. And looking at these 4 questions and then their findings together, when we look at question 1 and question 2, if you just stood those out and we talk about I think really comes into play here, and we assume everybody had the same experience, the policy has really worked as students are recognizing sexual misconduct and reporting sexual misconduct at a higher level. And that's what the policy wanted to have happen. Populations are responding better to the data. And so question 3 and question 4 indicate that while the policy overall is are not necessarily responding. And so you see the dominance in these types of studies by white cisgender women in the studies. So limitations of this study, as with any study, the sample that we use is not necessarily representative of all college students. In Missouri, it's a good sample in terms of numbers and things like that, but it's not necessarily representative. There are some limitations for many of the social locations. Some of the social location groups were very small. So when you were looking at a trans Latino man or something like that, that's a very small group, and so the ability to make sense of that data was very difficult. And then there's some limitations on the instrument. Obviously, it's not an instrument that I designed or anything like that. It's an instrument that has been verified with validity and that sort of thing, but in reliability. But it is a long instrument. It's more than 250 questions, and some of the variables that we use, the wording changed ever so slightly throughout the time of the study. It wasn't significant. I don't think it impacted understanding of what the question was asking, but there was some slight changes in year 4 and 5 on the wording of the study, so, or of the questions. So that is a limitation. Thinking about suggestions for the future, what the study might tell us is that we need marginalized populations involved in the policy creation process. Maybe thinking about that from a community health model, in terms of making sure that the community is involved in the process of creating the policy. And additional efforts to reach out to marginalized populations for reporting practices to make sure that those reporting practices provide ease and welcoming reporting. Thinking about future research, some qualitative investigations, perhaps into some of those marginalized populations that we had, that I had difficulty understanding their experience because of the limitations on the data, and quantitative investigations using a more in-depth surveying process to dive a little deeper into some of these questions that we could get more clarity on. I would love to see a similar investigation from 2016 or 2017 to 2021. The current administration views sexual misconduct very differently than the previous administration. And so there may be some very different results over this time period than we had previously. Lastly, impact of the policy on the perpetrator. One of the things that that would be interesting to know is whether or not this policy has impacted those who commit sexual misconduct in sort of a similar fashion or different fashion to those who have experienced sexual misconduct, and what their response to the policy would be. So, with that being said, I welcome any comments, questions, discussion about the study. I'll stop sharing.
Anybody wants to ask questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
John, this is Dawn Schaefer.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
One of the things that you and I have both been involved in are the awareness and prevention efforts on campus. And you were saying how what we're doing isn't reducing the likelihood of sexual misconduct. So I'm curious if you have thoughts or ideas on how we improve.
Yeah, I think what the literature showed is that awareness campaigns and that sort of stuff were very ineffective, trying to dispel rape myths and things like that. Increased knowledge, but didn't decrease likelihood of it occurring. What has shown some effectiveness in the research is skill building, and so it's about teaching folks that may experience sexual misconduct how to respond and to be aggressive in that response. And so some of the things that I've tried to integrate into some of our training that we provided, we did this in a Still Healthy and things like that, but also with the students, is talking about not only what these rape myths are and things like that. That information is still good to know, but also talking about here's some tools of action you can take. If you are experiencing this, here are actions you can take. If you see somebody else experience this, here are actions you can take. So instead of focusing on here's knowledge, it's here are tools that you can actually put into action in order to address that issue, feel confident that what you're recognizing is not okay and that you can respond to it.
Yeah, that's really good, John. And just to follow up, when you were talking about the trauma of reporting can be as bad or worse than the trauma of the experience, that just really bothered me. And how do you feel ATSU? I mean, are we doing what we can do to help the reporting experience to not be traumatic?
Yeah, I think we work really hard at that. I think it's, we don't get to decide whether or not it's traumatic, but I think at the same time, like we have a team of about 14 wonderful folks that have volunteered to be investigators and advocates and share various roles. And one of the things I try to do with them is provide quarterly trainings about different components of the process. And the last training we did was on trauma. And how participants might experience trauma or understand trauma who are victim survivors. And so I think for us, it's about understanding kind of what that looks like and how that feels. And I think also when we do the larger trainings, going back to that Still Healthy and things like that, we talk about the concept of the car accident, which is a metaphor from an ATSU trainer, the Association of Title IX Administrators, where when someone comes to you with a sexual misconduct experience, treat it like a car accident, where you've just seen someone be in a car accident. The thing you ask them is, are you okay? What do you need? And how can I help you? And you don't ask things like, why were you driving that way? Or were you going too fast? Or what did you have to drink? You just ask, are you okay? What do you need? Is there someone I can call, or how can I help you? And really focusing on those very specific skills in terms, instead of trying to think about, I need to investigate or understand this situation, but really starting with that initial step. And then I talk a lot with people that have come to me and said, hey, I've got this person that has this report, has this experience. And I say, okay, well, let's think about how we want to take this experience in. So they have to repeat the story as few times as possible and that kind of stuff, while still thinking about our due process aspects on the other side for someone who's accused, but really thinking about how do we take that report in a way that makes sense to the person who's experienced sexual misconduct.
Thank you very much.
John?
Yeah.
I was wondering, initially you gave a number that was talking about 1 in 5 women, I think 1 in 16 men experience, is it a rape or attempted rape specifically on campus?
Yeah.
I don't doubt that number. I'm just wondering what, is there like a study or something that comes from specifically, or is that just kind of a number?
Yeah,
that,
let me let's see. Got it right here, I think. Let's see, where's the one? Got it here somewhere. Just give me a second.
And you can email it to me if it'd take too long to dig up. I'm just always like to put context behind things, and I'd like to read if there is a specific study that comes from.
It is, it's from a study, Fisher, Cullen, and Turner in 2000, and let me make a note, and I'll send that to you, but so it was a study that basically what it did is it took a smaller population over a shorter period of time, and they determined that it was a group, and they had, like, I think it was like 1.6% of this group had sexual misconduct over this short period of time, and they sort of extrapolated that out to the entire college career to get to the 20 to 25%. But I can send you the name of the study so you can look it up. No problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And John, was that just in undergraduate?
Most of this research is undergraduate. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
John, do you have any thoughts about how we can encourage people who belong to a non-privileged group from reporting or seeking assistance at ATSU?
Yeah, I think that's, a lot about building relationships. And so I think it's about, reaching out to those groups and through other intermediaries to connect with groups to build trust in the process. I think, one of the things is that it's a slow process to build that trust because of, the way society works and things like that. Folks in marginalized populations often have many years of experience of not being treated well and not being respected and trusted and these types of venues. And so a lot of it is about reaching out, developing those relationships. But the other component is thinking about things that can make our overall culture more welcoming for all members of our community. And I think about some of the opportunities I've had to work with our diversity and inclusion office around some of the things we're doing with training and stuff like that. And I think continuing to move towards not only some intentional outreach and developing trust with some of those groups, but also thinking about what is the overall culture here at ATSU, and how do we make sure that folks would assume that the response would be supportive and that sort of thing. So I think it's a combination of those two.
Just as a follow-up, have there been any specific outreaches to some of these marginalized communities at ATSU to begin some of these conversations?
I think it's limited so far, and it's something that I think we're working on, but it's limited so far, and so it's something that we're going through a policy review process right now because the federal guidelines are changing, and so I think that's part of what I want to do in that process as well, is kind of follow my own guidance and bring some others into that process.
I think John's done a great job of bringing other investigators into our into the ability of people to have a connectivity when they give a testimony or anything, and kudos to him for expanding that circle, and kudos to those who have volunteered to help us out in that investigation process, because that's part of the step in making a more inclusive environment. So good job on that.
You mentioned that the federal guidelines are changing. In what ways are they changing that may affect how we respond?
So the Department of Education, so there haven't been regulations on Title IX and government response since 1975. The 2011 and 2014 guidelines were just guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And so guidance isn't sort of tied to law so much. And the VAWA reauthorization was more about support in educational processes. The regulations that are being put in place by the current Department of Education focus on what are the investigative requirements. And there's some good changes coming that focus on due process and making sure that those who are accused have their rights respected as well, and that's a really important component of this. Some of the changes, I think, some of the factors that may make it a little bit harder for those who are reporting sexual misconduct are about the avenues in which reporting can be officially received by the government or by the institution, and then how to go through that investigative process, and then the requirement of a live hearing. And those regulations haven't officially come down yet, so we'll see what they say when they do. But there's going to be likelihood, based on court decisions and what the regulations have requested, there'll need to be a live hearing, and so some of that may be have somewhat of a chilling effect on reporting, because a live hearing, when you talk about that harm from the reporting process, having to repeat your story, having your story cross-examined and things like that, rather than investigated by somebody who's trained in how to respond to these types of investigations, is going to be a little bit of a different process. And so I think when we think about, when I think about our process and how we need to reach out to all different members of our constituency, I think we're going to need to be even more intentional about that, to be sure that folks feel comfortable reporting instance and
I'm afraid we've lost John. There you go. We lost you for a second. Are you back with us, John?
Yeah, sorry, my internet connection went out, and I don't know what happened. It was weird.
Okay. All right. Does anybody else have any questions then?
I had one more question. You mentioned like future research ideas. I'm curious, are those future research things you personally are thinking about pursuing, or are those just more general ideas for others who would be doing research?
They're presented as more general ideas. I would love to pursue them. I would just have to find the time.
Yeah.
And that's always the rub, I think, in academic studies, is finding the time, because to do it properly, it takes quite a bit. So I'm definitely interested in it, Dawn, but whether or not I allot the time, I think, is the question. I think the time is always there, I should say, but whether or not I choose to allot the time, I think will be time will tell.
I had one other, one question with a follow-up question. I guess I wanted to make sure that I was clear. I'll bear my ignorance a little bit, but when you talk about intersectionality, you seem to be talking a lot about like ethnic divisions. I'm wondering, is that like how is intersectional defined exactly? What does that mean?
Yeah, sure. No, so it's essentially the social location of any sort of aspect of our identity. And so it's not limited necessarily to marginalized or vulnerable populations. So like for my identity, for example, I'll talk about me. Like there's an intersection of me being a white male, okay? And so my whiteness has a component and my maleness has a component, but being a white male, a specific social location that isn't driven necessarily by my whiteness or my maleness, but by both of those together. And so it's the concept of sort of moving beyond variables, just as white and male being variables, or but moving into that's a specific social location that has aspects related to race and racism, and has aspects to sex and sexism. And so understanding those social dynamics and how they impact that specific place. And so it was driven out of some court cases actually in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, where there was a complaint made by a black woman in the workplace. And when the court evaluated the environment for her, they evaluated it from interviewing black males in the workplace. Which is a different intersectional location. And so she developed this theory from there, sort of understanding that, yes, the black men and the black women shared blackness, but how they experienced that as men and as women was dramatically different. And so it's that concept that just because, we have these two different components, where they intersect is a very specific experience. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes it much more clear. Thank you. My follow-up question was that I'm sure that there's a study or there are studies that show the disparities between reporting sexual misconduct between that happened with two students versus that might happen between a faculty member and a student. And I'm wondering, when you talked about further questions in that realm, I would, my mind was already thinking, I wonder if there's any studies that are pertaining to like intersectional divisions, and those, if they vary widely depending on intersectionality, or even just within like a race or a gender or something.
Yeah, I mean, there's some that touch on that. It's really kind of limited. I think when you think about the power dynamic between like student to student versus student to faculty member or student to staff member, I think there's some literature there about and some good case studies there about what's occurred. There's some good court cases about what's occurred in those different settings. But I think, I think that's an area honestly to explore further. There's not as much as you would think, especially if you get into the concepts of, what's the intersectional identity of a student in that setting, what's the intersectional identity of a staff member or faculty member in those settings, and that really hasn't been explored. It'd be an interesting if you looked at court cases or just the reports and records in a higher education institution, it might be an interesting case study analysis.
Thanks. And I'll just shoot you an email to, you could, if you wouldn't mind copying me on that article that you looked up, just a reminder. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I've had a number of students approach me regarding research in this area. I know you said it depends on if you have time, if you continue to do this research, and when. Are you interested in having students assist you in this process? And then if so, how would you like me to go about communicating to the student and vice versa?
I would say just shoot us both an email and kind of introduce us, and then we can talk about what our options would be. That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well, do we have any other questions? We don't seem to have anything in the chat either. So I guess we're done for the morning or the afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for the presentation, John. It was very educational.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. And thanks for everybody for hanging in and watching.
Yep.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.